April 10th, 1936. The sky over Manhattan was the color of ash, the city still bruised by the lingering grip of the Great Depression. Along the East River, Beekman Place, two narrow blocks of refined residences, stood as a sanctuary for diplomats, businessmen, and writers. Here, doors were heavy, curtains thick, and silence cultivated like an art. It was the kind of street where scandal felt impossible and violence unthinkable. But that morning, inside apartment 3B, silence concealed something dreadful. Shortly before noon, two workmen arrived carrying a newly upholstered sofa. They knocked. No answer. They called out. Silence. A door to the bathroom hung slightly ajar. One of the men nudged it open, and the illusion of safety on Beekman Place shattered forever. In the bathtub lay Nancy Violet Evans Titterton, 34 years old, novelist and wife, her body pale against the porcelain. Her silk robe clung damply to her frame. Around her neck, a short cord no more than 13 inches long bit cruelly into the flesh. The bathwater was cold, the apartment still. Detectives would soon note the odd details. No broken locks, no forced entry, no missing valuables. Whoever had entered this home had left behind only two things: the cord and a coarse strand of horsehair, grotesquely out of place in a Manhattan apartment of such elegance. By evening, newspapers blared the headlines: "Bathtub murder at Beekman Place." Neighbors whispered. Reporters crowded the street, and the entire city recoiled. Even hardened detectives admitted unease. It was too quiet, one later said, as if the killer had taken something invisible with him. Nancy's death was not only a crime, it was a riddle written in silence. A riddle whose fragments we are about to piece together. If you are here with us tonight, welcome to Chronicles of Dread, where history's starkest corners are reopened, and the silence of the dead speaks again. The murder of Nancy Titterton is not merely a story of one woman's death. It is the exposure of a city's hidden dangers, the collapse of illusions about safety, and a reminder that horror does not always come from shadows, but from the ordinary figures who pass unnoticed through our daily lives. Before we descend deeper, subscribe now so you never miss these forgotten stories. Like this video to bring Nancy's voice back from the archives. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Would you dare walk down Beekman Place knowing what waited behind its immaculate doors? To understand the strange, chilling fate of Nancy Titterton, one must first descend into the world of New York in the 1930s, a city glittering with promise on the surface, but restless, fractured, and haunted beneath. The year was 1936. America was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs had brought some relief. Breadlines shortened, jobs returned to factories, and banks once shuttered reopened their doors. But the scars of the collapse had not healed. Families carried memories of lost homes, vanished savings, and nights spent wondering whether food would arrive the next day. On the streets of Manhattan, contradictions ruled. A man in a worn suit, his shoes scuffed from endless walks, might shuffle past a woman wrapped in a fur coat stepping from a chauffeured car. The Bowery, lined with fluff houses and soup kitchens, lay only a subway ride away from Broadway, where neon lights washed over the faces of theatergoers and tourists. Harlem pulsed with the Harlem Renaissance, jazz drifting from clubs, poets gathering in smoky rooms. a new cultural voice demanding recognition, while across Wall Street still shimmered with symbols of wealth, though the cracks in its marble had already been shown to the world. Crime, too, lingered like a stain. The Prohibition era had technically ended in 1933, but the underworld it created did not vanish with the stroke of a law. Bootleggers, gangsters, and racketeers had tasted power and profit, and they adapted. The police, overstretched and often compromised, could not erase the networks of corruption that had been built in speakeasies and back alleys. New Yorkers woke daily to headlines that swung between glamour and horror, the dazzling marriage of a society heiress on one page, the discovery of a body in a vacant lot on the next. For women, the city was both opportunity and danger. In neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, women found new freedoms. Independence. Creative circles, careers in journalism, publishing, and the arts. Yet danger was omnipresent. Women traveling alone after dark risked harassment. Apartment doors, heavy and bolted, represented more than privacy. They were fragile barriers between sanctuary and peril. Beekman Place, where Nancy and her husband lived, was one of those sanctuaries, a short street overlooking the East River, lined with stately brownstones and luxury apartments. It was described by real estate agents as the address of quiet dignity. Diplomats, society figures, and literary minds sought its seclusion. Its manicured courtyards and carefully tended facades promised an insulation from the chaos of the wider city. To walk down Beekman Place was to believe, for a moment, that the turbulence of the Depression could be held at bay by stone walls and velvet drapes. But appearances deceive. In reality, New York was a city where privilege and poverty brushed shoulders daily. The porters and maids who kept Beekman Place gleaming often returned home to cramped boarding houses. The upholsterers and carpenters who carried furniture up its staircases often lived lives scarred by unemployment, petty crime, and desperation. The city's elegance was built, quite literally, on the shoulders of men like John Fiorenza, invisible workers who moved through wealthy homes like shadows, rarely noticed until something went terribly wrong. And so, in 1936, Manhattan was both a stage of glittering light and a maze of shadows. It was a city that demanded stories, that fed on them. The murder of Nancy Titterton would soon provide one of its most shocking tales. A collision of refinement and violence, of sanctuary and betrayal, a reminder that even the most polished doors could be breached by horror. While Beekman Place stood as a symbol of refinement, New York beyond its quiet facades thrummed with a nervous energy. It was a city in transition, caught between the despair of the Depression and the slow promise of recovery, that tension between progress and collapse. Security and danger formed the backdrop against which Nancy's tragedy unfolded. The 1930s were marked by an uneasy optimism. On radio broadcasts, President Roosevelt spoke of a New Deal for the American people, and many clung to his words like lifelines. Yet on the ground, the city remained restless. Labor strikes erupted in factories. Unemployed veterans marched through streets demanding recognition. Newsboys hawked papers with headlines that veered wildly from hope to horror. Stock prices rising again, followed the next day by woman found slain in Bronx flat. New York had always been a city of extremes, but in the 1930s, those extremes sharpened into contrasts too stark to ignore. By day, Secretaries and clerks poured into skyscrapers, while pickpockets and con men stalked their steps. By night, couples danced in Harlem nightclubs or in the Rainbow Room atop Rockefeller Center, while others huddled in doorways to escape the wind. In that atmosphere, crime seemed to bleed into the fabric of the city itself. Murder was no longer shocking in the slums or on darkened streets. It was expected. What shocked the public most was when crime breached the sanctuaries of respectability. The homes of the wealthy, the apartments of the cultured, the addresses listed in the society pages. Those cases stirred dread not only because of their violence, but because they shattered the illusion that money and status could insulate one from danger. The newspapers thrived on that dread. The tabloid era was in full swing, with the Daily News, the New York Evening Journal, and the New York Post battling for the most lurid photographs, the most scandalous copy. Crime reporting was theatrical crime scenes drawn in detail. Suspects paraded in handcuffs before cameras. Victims' lives dissected with both pity and voyeurism. For editors, A Murder in Beekman Place was the perfect storm. Elegance and savagery bound together in one story. Law enforcement, too, was evolving. The New York Police Department, criticized for corruption in the 1920s, was under pressure to modernize. Detectives relied on witness testimony and physical clues, but forensic science was still in its infancy. Fingerprinting was a new tool. Crime labs were just beginning to use trace evidence like fibers and hair. DNA lay decades in the future. In 1936, a single coarse strand of horsehair could be enough to tip the scales of justice. And then there was the social role of women in the 1930s. Nancy Titterton was not unusual in seeking a career as a writer. Women were publishing novels, editing magazines, and working in journalism. Yet their independence existed in tension with old expectations to be wives, hostesses, figures of grace in polished homes. Nancy embodied both worlds, cultured, ambitious, yet married into the life of an IRCA executive in a prestigious Manhattan apartment. Her death, therefore, carried a symbolic weight. She was not a woman living on society's margins. She was its very image of respectability. That was what made her murder so chilling. It was not only the brutality of the act, but the collapse of illusions it represented. If violence could find her in her silk robe, in her bathtub, in her sanctuary on Beekman Place, it could find anyone. And so, the stage was set, a city of contradictions, a neighborhood that promised safety, a woman who seemed untouchable, and somewhere in its restless streets, a young upholsterer named John Fiorenza, carrying within him the shadows of failure, instability, and rage, was about to step into her world. The story of Nancy Titterton would not only shock New York, it would expose the fragility of the walls people built to keep horror out and prove that those walls were far thinner than they believed. To understand the tragedy of Beekman Place, we must meet the people whose lives intersected in that April of 1936. They came from different worlds: refinement, respectability, desperation, and duty, and together they created the constellation of the Bathtub Murder. Nancy was 34 years old, a woman suspended between old-world elegance and new-world ambition. She was born in England, raised in a family that valued literature and refinement. Friends often remarked on her voice, a gentle English accent softened by years in America, a voice that seemed perfectly suited to polished drawing rooms and literary salons. When she arrived in New York, Nancy carried both poise and ambition. She sought not just to host or to marry well, but to create. She published pieces in the New Yorker, that magazine of wit and sophistication. And she pursued her own novels in the quiet hours of her life. Her work was modest but promising. To those who knew her, Nancy was more than a wife, she was a woman of thought, culture, and artistry. Her appearance mirrored her nature. She was slender, with dark hair usually styled neatly, favoring clothes that were fashionable yet understated. Photographs from the time show her as a woman of presence, elegant without flamboyance, charming without excess. She belonged in the cultivated world of Beekman Place, where refinement was the highest currency. Nancy's friends described her as warm but reserved. She preferred quiet gatherings to loud parties, and conversation to spectacle. Yet beneath her calm exterior was a determination to write, to carve a name in New York's cultural scene. She was the kind of woman who left impressions not through scandal, but through grace. Her husband, Howard, was an executive with the Radio Corporation of America, the powerhouse of modern communications. He embodied the respectable upward mobility of the age, a man of steady career, professional polish, and financial stability. Together, he and Nancy represented the life many aspired to during the Depression years, a household unshaken by poverty. Cultured, safe, inviolable. The Titterton's apartment at 22 Beekman Place reflected this stability. The rooms were tastefully furnished, the walls lined with books, the air cultivated with an aura of refinement. It was not ostentation, but elegance, an environment meant for literature, for quiet dinners, for the slow rhythm of upper-middle-class life. Howard himself was remembered as serious but devoted. He admired Nancy's writing, supported her work, and provided the foundation of security that allowed her to pursue it. His role in the tragedy was that of the absent figure, the man who left for work that April morning believing his wife to be safe, only to be called back into a nightmare. His anguish at the police station, when summoned to identify Nancy's body, was reported in hushed tones in the papers. He had lost not only his wife, but the illusion of sanctuary that Beekman Place had promised. In stark contrast stood John Fiorenza, the man whose name would forever be linked to Nancy S. Born into an ordinary family, Fiorenza's life was marked by instability, restlessness, and petty crime. By his early 20s, he had already accumulated a record: burglary, theft, brushes with the law that painted a portrait of a man incapable of steady life. In 1936, Fiorenza found work as an upholsterer's assistant. It was menial labor, hauling sofas, repairing furniture, restuffing cushions with coarse horsehair. The job brought him into the homes of the wealthy, places like Beekman Place, where he was expected to remain invisible. His hands touched the fabrics of privilege, but he himself belonged to the city's restless shadows. Colleagues described him as nervous, unstable, prone to erratic moods. He drifted between jobs, between the straight path and the lure of crime. His eyes, one said, always seemed to be looking elsewhere, as though chasing a thought no one else could see. That April morning, Fiorenza carried a sofa into Nancy's home. But what he carried with him was far heavier: a lifetime of frustration, desire, and rage that would erupt into violence within the quiet walls of apartment 3B. The New York Police Department in the 1930s was a force struggling to modernize. Years of corruption during Prohibition had tarnished its reputation, But homicide detectives remained among the most seasoned in the country. They had walked into alleyway murders, gangland executions, and domestic tragedies countless times before. Yet the case of Nancy Titterton unnerved even them. Lieutenant John McGohey, one of the officers present, would later remark that the crime scene carried an atmosphere unlike any he had encountered. The apartment was too tidy, the violence too precise. It was as though, he said, the killer had stepped into a sanctuary and left behind not chaos, but silence. The detectives assigned to the case represented the spectrum of New York law enforcement in the 1930s, veterans hardened by years in the field, and younger officers eager to prove themselves in a city where sensational cases could make or break reputations. They worked in a time when forensic science was still emerging, where fingerprints, trace fibers, and simple observation were often the only weapons they had. Beyond the police, there were others whose lives intersected with Nancy's. Friends from her literary circles remembered her fondly, a woman who attended luncheons, discussed manuscripts, and encouraged younger writers. For them, the news of her death was not only shocking, but inconceivable. How could the woman they knew, so gentle, so refined, have met such a brutal end? Neighbors, too, were drawn unwillingly into the case. Residents of Beekman Place, accustomed to discretion and silence, found themselves questioned by reporters, their names splashed across tabloids. Some spoke of seeing workmen enter the building. Others admitted they had noticed nothing unusual at all. That was perhaps the most chilling detail. In a place so carefully tended, horror had entered and left without anyone noticing. As the investigation closed in, Firenze emerged as the central figure. He was not a mobster, not a notorious gangster, not a figure from the underworld who might have been expected to commit such a crime. Instead, he was ordinary, an assistant upholsterer, paid a few dollars a day to haul furniture through wealthy apartments. Yet in that ordinariness lay the true terror. Firenze was a man who passed unnoticed. He entered homes, delivered furniture, nodded politely, and left. No one paid him more than a glance. He was invisible in the very spaces that promised security, and it was that invisibility that allowed him to strike. For Nancy, the contrast could not have been greater. She was a figure of grace, a woman of words and presence. Firenze was restless, unstable, a shadow on the periphery of society. Their worlds should never have touched, but on April 10th, 1936, they collided with fatal consequence. Trong Lung, Luthan Nin Thunshatho Kula Via Kanan Imi, Ki. Fruit Shine Shine Be the Lai Fang. Sang Clay Gu Chua Trong Lung Hesfai Lun Dun. Qi Sung, Methazi M Trong Sung, Ba Chung Tratra Quite Line, the Mensith Levin, Vo Ten Nenai. Amang Theo Zien Pin, Dao Nunchi Jite Lon. Ve Yuli Eldri Kinzam, Ve Isliu Nu Sigo Chuan Ji Lactan Sian, the Fung Then. Si Vang Vrigiem Vriel Nangant. A Tinging Du I Wretch. Tang Kuntrung Lun Trong Hai I Sung Lun. Kani Kania Kaiki Ra Teek Skades. Mine Endiak Sinem Bekshi Dayan Trung. T Tania Na Ji Runarast FPZI. Kvi Si I Jun. Hei Thong Ying Tu Exu Kaka. Nutty Thanu Jung Tru Kanzang Trung Chuen Vei Ha Trong Nu. Shexi Sian Ninchidai Trunkan Trong Gov. Idli Dun Long Thai. Muts trong ban un jigai pi but mine. Nun chian jing and jui via debts. Tits si prumbian trong imol nangang angs. Nungan vrun pin chapi chun. Rai teet fet. His li sia. Susi funfa ko ke temenavra. Bain trong el giana tiam. I emmo freeing ens. On trung huntet quakang si as a v. Reaxuang nen it launen en via vemen. Treven twantum. Rukren munnen fundren nananchivet beaten en nanya elitai. Long eli ezadzc in being benite. Sio cheesism. Nachi thai actush chi delro. Wazaitent meist. Toisit si chun luch fetch vang quan. Nan ung hanan nanju an jie bek su che vang quan bejen pi. Kai nun thi ji. Nanding tingjing si pigach ki elain I lenvan ti niu hetraten. Vi logi hech. Muddy bon te lanan tibati chi te canvero thrum te amenti chung tre. Clean enta thiti lun. Quay fust lely solj laich sia gankang tai. Ze si quan. Tronco conkex chi by chi captai fivan. Venzian pin big sang trufalai. Chapi chun soy ra kunfung. Tojianana. Lufem he alien ing divang bilan ding treaty e gieds. Sexwa rri. Yo ano sang rachnet bien gui gia narj. Sung quan lang chach bien trana. Long iloneng vang trun. Yes, shuth of emnon and chemen chemem vioba, cape extram and teps. Lofi trashing he I zingzi I. Sang kong en ameji lelti. Dan rung rai. Tuni tung vi te liuli en vang line. Chathamarai. Rung vren. Nanasa si an haidalan. Tet si brian an chuvang luther devenens chi, mayo mem. Zail of hum rung tuum tai. Z o a b b bing cr hi te. Tugan luzi ganian. Ban te lun nu yush chi kankun quanmun ti chung tre. An tajit lai. Nang veshi pengan. Liu via pek suung nenite. Trong on and ho ho leven. And theji argang mt ray tria traganua, dagan jua to hang chensi to you. Nung thun en of a byam zia kayan ein en em su. Si jun no vang vang tia gayu aet. Ching chio vio na. My. Tang gai kai kuda thit en I gai. Via ao on via zi fi. Munsan trung bay ke ki het elian. Laure sia, naning sikan sia gn nia daigon saye, ti ba jip. Nagoi kia. Jitha ret, jamen henshi dai nanin shirai jukach. Trong jishi a cmmativram majiang sia. Kung ji in anatianan. Then zayin pin ve tu laya sing vif. Ba chung tre chati lenj. Trong jung. Kung fly bananjidai he. Mai li hangcheksi jia triangai chen tricks. Gdugging empty trunning butch. Mying si clay ni rung. Me trungering. Chenchi v te juin. Lussi sang ellen. As I tate 9. Gajan prungialan chut hide healing gay chun jia. Tangam jiong. Gleeing prakan zi sif. Vang lumen arnen gp. Changing uncha bao ji life livin. Vasisa si die. Say stame mai falei. Clean fung being ti sema lai. Nung bante nananchi bai ving lot vernonra. Lum, but. Nuchi ti leldriquano. Dai thes trea ba ki pek susao. Touching cruntre trucon. Ting si kai man di. Tying gaiam vang lenin en enlom. Kang a kunfen and baitlai sees diura that. Nalo. Li em dry. Si prane kriturai limit touch. Shizayu lelien ang ju juchian and hanyar hunern tri nen is a hisquan sin en nu. Ithayu hung chek sexuai trivia vangan zying dankara. As the first shock of Nancy's death rippled through the city, detectives set about the difficult tasks of reconstructing her final hours. The timeline was narrow, almost unnervingly so. Howard left the apartment around 9:30. The upholsterers arrived a little before noon. In that space of less than 3 hours, Nancy had met her killer. The police searched the apartment again and again, looking for overlooked signs. The cord was studied carefully. Its fibers suggested it was the sort used in workshops, not households. The horsehair was bagged and examined, trivial to some, but to detectives, it was a telling trace, a link to the furniture trade. Their questions turned to the building staff. Had anyone seen unfamiliar faces that morning? The doorman admitted he had let in several workmen, deliverymen, porters, and the upholsterers who carried the sofa upstairs. They had seemed ordinary, routine, invisible as most workers were in the eyes of Beekman Place residents. It was here that suspicion began to settle on one man, John Fiorenza. At first, his presence had been incidental. He was simply there with his employer, delivering a piece of furniture. But the more the detectives looked, the more the small details began to align. He had opportunity, he had access, and the horsehair the coarse, out-of-place strand linked directly to the trade in which he labored. When detectives questioned Fiorenza, he seemed nervous, unsettled. He stammered, contradicted himself, shifted in his chair. He denied knowing anything beyond discovering the body. Yet his answers lacked conviction. His hands trembled. His eyes darted. To the detectives, trained to read nerves, it was a sign that he carried more than shock. But suspicion alone was not enough. They needed proof. And in 1936, proof was fragile. There were no DNA tests, no advanced labs. They relied on witness testimony, fibers, fingerprints, and the cracks in a suspect's story. Meanwhile, the media transformed the case into theater. Sketches of Nancy appeared in newspapers, her face framed by headlines of horror. Photographs of Beekman Place ran beside sensational copy, describing the haunted silence of the apartment. Reporters speculated wildly. Was the killer a jilted lover, a burglar surprised by Nancy, or something darker, a man who had selected her deliberately for reasons no one could yet fathom? Neighbors found themselves besieged. I heard nothing, one resident insisted to a reporter. Another admitted to hearing a faint thud, though they could not say when. The more the press pressed, the more rumors multiplied. Some whispered that Nancy had been writing about darker subjects, that perhaps she had attracted attention she did not want. Others insisted it was a crime of opportunity, that Beekman Place had been breached by desperation, not design. In truth, the investigation itself was split. Some detectives believed Fiorenza had acted in impulse, seizing the chance when he found Nancy alone. Others wondered if the crime had been planned. Why bring such a short cord? If not with purpose, why strike so swiftly, leaving so little disruption? The questions haunted them, even as their net closed tighter around Fiorenza. By early May, the public demanded answers. The bathtub murder had become more than a crime. It was a symbol of the city's fragility. If violence could reach Beekman Place, it could reach anywhere. Pressure mounted on the NIP to resolve the case. And so, quietly but firmly, they brought Fiorenza back for questioning. He was no longer just a workman who stumbled into horror. He was the prime suspect. But what drove him? Was it opportunity, obsession, or something far stranger? The detectives would soon discover that behind Fiorenza's nervous exterior lay a man teetering on the edge of collapse, one who'd no longer keep his shadows contained. The questioning of John Fiorenza stretched into long hours inside the gray, smoke-thick rooms of NIPT headquarters. At first, he clung to his story, that he and his employer had entered the apartment only to discover Nancy's body, that he had been as shocked as anyone else. His words were flat, his sentences halting, but his nerves betrayed him. Detectives noted his trembling hands, his darting eyes, the sweat gathering at his brow despite the cool spring air. They pressed harder. Where had he been in the hours before the sofa delivery? Could anyone account for his movements? Why did his account shift each time they circled back to the timeline? The horsehair became their weapon. Confronted with the detail, Fiorenza faltered. Yes, he admitted. Horsehair clung to his clothing from his work. But how, then, had it been found near Nancy's body? His explanation unraveled. The cord, too, was traced back to the kind used in upholstery shops. Not something a housewife would keep in her apartment. Detectives circled him like predators, pointing out each contradiction. His employer, they noted, had remained calm and consistent in testimony. Fiorenza, by contrast, could not hold his story together. As the hours wore on, his defenses cracked. At last, in a voice broken and halting, he confessed. He admitted to entering Nancy's apartment under the pretense of his work, seizing the opportunity when he found her alone. He described advancing on her, his attempt to force himself upon her, and the moment she resisted, in his rage and panic, he tightened the cord around her neck. The act was swift, brutal, and final. Yet even as he confessed, questions lingered. Why bring such a cord? Was it chance, a tool at hand? Or had he carried it with purpose? Why so short, so precise? Some detectives suspected premeditation. Others saw only impulse violence born of opportunity and desperation. Fiorenza's words did not answer these doubts. They left the truth shrouded, unsettling, incomplete. News of the confession electrified the city. Headlines screamed. Upholsterer admits beating and strangling woman in bath. The public devoured every sordid detail. But beneath the surface, many felt only unease. The killer was not a gangster or a phantom. He was a workman, a figure of daily life, someone who entered homes unnoticed. That revelation was far more terrifying than mystery. The detectives had their man. The district attorney prepared the case. But Beekman Place would never be the same. Neighbors confessed they no longer trusted the invisible figures who crossed their thresholds. Deliverymen, carpenters, upholsterers all suddenly seemed potential threats, and even as Fiorenza awaited trial, the unanswered questions remained. Was it truly a crime of impulse, or had Nancy been marked in advance, chosen by a man whose quiet exterior masked darker obsessions? The escalation of horror had reached its peak, the killer unmasked, but the meaning of the crime forever elusive. The trial of John Fiorenza opened in 1937 under a pall of anticipation. For months, The case had simmered in the press. Every detail of Nancy Titterton's as murder dissected, every rumor amplified. By the time Fiorenza walked into the courtroom, he was no longer an anonymous upholsterer-s assistant. He was the villain of a city's darkest story. The courthouse was packed. Reporters jostled for space, their pencils scratching furiously, eager to capture the expressions of the accused. Sketch artists filled pages with Fiorenza's gaunt face, his eyes shadowed, his posture tense. He looked nothing like the monsters of fiction, no grotesque features, no wild eyes. He looked ordinary, and that ordinariness unsettled the public more than anything. The prosecution painted him as a predator lurking in plain sight. They presented the cord. The horsehair, the testimony of detectives who had wrested the confession from him. They described Nancy's final moments in chilling detail, her grace and elegance cruelly silenced by a man she should never have had to fear. The defense countered weakly. They spoke of Fiorenza's troubled mind, of impulses he could not control, of a man driven by desperation rather than malice. They hinted at coercion in his confession, suggesting detectives had pushed too hard. But the evidence weighed heavily, and the jury could not ignore it. Witnesses took the stand. Howard Titterton, pale and devastated, spoke of leaving his wife that morning, never to see her alive again. Neighbors described the eerie stillness of the building that day. Experts testified to the origin of the cord and the horsehair, piece by piece. The narrative closed around Fiorenza like a tightening noose. The tabloids feasted on every moment. Headlines screamed, "Bath murderer faces jury. Husband tells of last morning with wife." The case was not just a legal proceeding, it was theater. And the city was riveted. The most haunting aspect of the trial was the absence that hung over it. Photographs of Nancy, elegant in evening gowns or seated at her writing desk, were displayed in the courtroom. They were meant to humanize her, to remind the jury of what had been lost, yet they also sharpened the contrast between the woman she was and the way she had been found. That dissonance was unbearable, and it lingered in every word spoken. After days of testimony, the closing arguments left no doubt. The prosecution declared Fiorenza guilty not only of murder, but of betraying the very trust that allowed him into Nancy's home. The defense could do little more than plead for mercy. When the jury retired, the deliberation was swift. Within hours, they returned with a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, by law, was death. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief, sorrow, and grim satisfaction. Reporters filed their stories. Neighbors whispered their reactions, and Fiorenza sat expressionless, as though the words had not yet reached him. For Howard, justice had been declared, but it was no solace for the city. The verdict closed the case, but it left behind unease. The killer was not a phantom, not a gangster, but a workman, an ordinary man. And that truth lingered, darker than any headline. After the verdict, John Fiorenza was transferred to Sing Sing Prison, north of New York City on the banks of the Hudson River. For decades, Sing Sing had been synonymous with death, the place where the state carried out its most feared punishment, the electric chair. To New Yorkers, the very name conjured images of cold stone walls, echoing corridors, and the hum of electricity waiting at the end of a hallway. Fiorenza's arrival was recorded in the prison ledger, just another name among hundreds who had passed through those gates. But his presence drew particular attention. He was not a gangster or a notorious mobster. He was not one of the killers from the underworld battles that filled headlines in the 1930s. He was, instead, an upholsterer's assistant, condemned for a crime that had shocked the city because it seemed both senseless and intimate. In his cell, he was described as restless, pacing, muttering to himself. Guards noted his nervous habits, biting his nails, tugging at his clothes, whispering half-formed thoughts. At times, he denied his guilt, insisting that detectives had forced a confession from him. At other times, he admitted in fragments, speaking of rage, of impulses he could not control. The press continued to follow his story. On the eve of his execution, newspapers ran pieces describing his final meals, his final words, his final hours. For the public, this was the conclusion to the Bathtub murder saga. For Fiorenza, it was the narrowing of his world to a single moment, the walk down the corridor known grimly as the last mile. On the night of his execution, in January 1937, witnesses gathered in the chamber. Reporters, officials, prison staff all assembled to see justice carried out. Fiorenza was led in, his face pale, his movements stiff. He muttered words few could catch, fragments of denial mixed with prayers. He was strapped into the oak chair, leather bindings across his arms and chest. The cap lowered over his head. The switch was thrown. A crackle filled the room, and the figure of John Fiorenza jerked violently. Then slumped. The current surged again. Then silence. The man who had entered Nancy Titterton's apartment was gone. Reduced to a brief headline the following morning, Fiorenza dies in chair. Bathtub murder executed. For the state, it was justice served. For the newspapers, it was the final act in a story that had captivated New York. But for Beekman Place, the shadow remained. The execution did not erase the memory of what had happened in apartment 3B. If anything, it deepened the unease, because the truth that lingered was this: Fiorenza was no monster of folklore, no notorious gangster. He was a man who carried sofas, who entered homes unnoticed, who blended into the background of ordinary life. And when he struck, it was without warning, without reason that anyone could truly understand. The city moved on, as cities always do, but Beekman Place would never fully shake the memory of the day its silence was broken. The execution of John Fiorenza closed the legal chapter of the Bathtub murder, but it did not silence the whispers that trailed through Beekman Place. Justice had been served. The papers declared a killer had been caught, tried, and executed. Yet for those who lived in the building, and for those who passed along its quiet street, the air never felt quite the same. In the months following Nancy Titterton's death, neighbors reported strange disturbances. Tenants spoke of water running in the bathroom at odd hours, though no one had turned the taps. Some swore they heard the faint echo of sobbing behind closed doors. Others claimed that mirrors fogged without cause, shapes appearing just at the edge of vision before vanishing. Perhaps these were nothing more than the fancies of nervous minds, primed by sensational headlines. But perhaps they were something else, echoes of a woman whose final moments had been marked by terror and silence. What unsettled many most was not the thought of Nancy's ghost, but the memory of how she had died not in some dark alley, not in the chaos of the city, but in the sanctuary of her own home. Beekman Place, once a byword for quiet refinement, became a symbol of fragility. The wealthy no longer trusted the invisible figures who carried their furniture, polished their halls, or delivered their goods. Safety, it seemed, had been an illusion all along. For Howard Titterton, life moved forward, but never returned to what it had been. His wife was gone, her voice silenced, her unwritten stories lost. He became a figure of tragedy in the city's collective memory, the man who left for work one morning, believing his wife was safe, and returned to a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As decades passed, Nancy's name faded from headlines. The bathtub murder became a footnote in the annals of New York crime. Yet the details still linger in archives, in yellowed newspapers, in the quiet retellings among historians of the macabre. The short cord, the horse hair, the silence. What makes this story chilling is not simply the crime, but what it revealed. That horror does not always come from shadows or legends. Sometimes it comes from the ordinary, from the unnoticed man who carries a sofa into your home and leaves behind silence. And so, the story of Nancy Titterton remains unresolved, in one sense, not in the question of who killed her, but in the question of why. Was it impulse? Was it obsession? Or was it something darker, a violence that defies explanation? These are the questions we leave you with tonight. Tell me, in the comments, what do you believe truly happened in apartment 3B? If you are drawn to histories too dreadful for polite society, subscribe to Chronicles of Dread. There are more stories waiting in the shadows, stories the world has tried to forget. Until next time. Remember, behind every polished door, behind every quiet street, there may be a story like this, waiting to be told, and the dead, as always, are never quite as silent as they seem.